Welcome to CASA Parenting. This is the optional week on domestic violence in families and the effects on children. I am Joylyn Allard, the therapist here at CASA, and I am joined today with Leslie Minton, the Children's Program Manager. As always, the course expectations are still the same. Please silence your phones, only answer if it's an emergency. Mobile phone or any other device usage during class can be a distraction from the materials for both yourself and others. Participate in conversation and ask questions when you feel comfortable doing so. However, do not monopolize the conversation and give others a chance to speak as well. Be kind and respectful to the instructors and other participants. Please respect the privacy and confidentiality of others in the group. And do not share materials that are provided about the group, so like PowerPoints, supplemental stuff with anyone else outside of the group. If you know someone who's interested in taking the course, please just refer them to us. Do not give them our material. And keep track of your own certificates. As instructors, we do not keep copies of them. If you are required to take this course and want the instructors to be able to speak to whomever is requiring you to complete the course to verify completion, please talk to us about a release form. And keep track of those certificates, because if those people are requiring you to come to classes, they may also require proof that you've been doing it, and those certificates should be sufficient. The learning objectives of this week are to identify domestic violence, identify the warning signs, identify how domestic violence in the home affects children and the family, and learn how the cycle of abuse and tactics within the power and control wheel. Disclosure: domestic violence, or DV, is a very traumatic and highly confusing form of abuse that distorts what it looks like to be in a partnership. It removes the equal rights and responsibilities within the partnership, which should be based on mutual respect. Safety must be the fundamental guiding principle in any and all efforts when assisting in escaping the violence and control from your intimate partner. Please note, today's topic can be a trigger for some individuals. At any time, if the lecture becomes too intense, please feel free to speak up, take a break, remove yourself from the lecture, and if you need one-on-one attention, myself will be available after class, or at any time. If you email me, call me, anything like that. If you need an appointment or just need to talk, just let me know. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is when one partner in an intimate relationship abuses the other. The abuse can be physical, sexual, emotional, or a combination of the three. There's also like financial abuse, all sorts of stuff. Domestic violence is an intimately woven, strategic, and complex pattern of increasingly frequent and harmful physical, sexual, psychological, and other abusive behaviors used to control the victim that repeats over and over again.
There are many common misunderstandings about what constitutes domestic violence. Having a better understanding of what domestic violence is can help you identify if you're experiencing it, or if someone you know is experiencing it. So let's begin today's conversation with a definition. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another partner. This occurs through a systematic pattern of intimidation, manipulation, humiliation, isolation, fear, terror, coercion, threats, blaming, or injury to the victim. That's a mouthful for sure. Sometimes domestic violence is also referred to as domestic abuse, relationship abuse, or intimate partner violence. Regardless of the term, they all mean abuse that occurs between married couples, cohabitating partners, dating partners, or relatives, and can involve children or siblings. Domestic violence happens to people in all walks of life, regardless of age, gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, education, profession, or socioeconomic status. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience some form of domestic violence during their lifetime, either directly as a victim of abuse or by witnessing it as children. If you're currently experiencing it, it's important to realize many other people have gone and are going through the same adversity, and that help is available. We'll talk more about help options later in this video. The most common age that domestic violence first occurs for both women and men is between 18 to 24 years old, although it can be experienced at any age and can be ongoing, even affecting seniors. A frequent misconception is that domestic violence always involves physical bodily harm. Often it does involve physical violence, but it frequently also involves emotional abuse, sexual abuse, economic abuse, and spiritual abuse. Some of these forms of abuse, which involve name-calling, threats, possessiveness, distrust, or countless other tactics, can be more difficult to detect because they don't leave marks, bruises, or broken bones, and because they may be dismissed or downplayed by both the victim and the abuser, as well as those around them, when in fact they are forms of domestic violence. Let's now examine 5 forms of domestic violence. Physical abuse can look like slapping, shoving, grabbing, pinching, biting, hair pulling, hitting, strangulation, beating, or at its most grave, assault with a deadly weapon. Not often talked about in the context of physical abuse is denying a partner medical care or forcing alcohol or drug use upon them. Most people can recognize physical abuse. Emotional abuse doesn't leave visible marks. However, it's just as harmful because it undermines an individual's self-worth or self-esteem, in addition to isolating them from friends, family, and their support system who can help. Sometimes you'll hear emotional abuse called coercive control or psychological abuse. In any event, it's akin to brainwashing through constant verbal criticism, belittling, shaming, guilt trips, name-calling, threats, sarcasm, interrogation, jealousy, trivialization, diminishing one's abilities, nonverbal coercion, harming pets, destroying valuables and property, isolation, or damaging a victim's relationship with his or her children. Sexual abuse is the next form. This involves forcing or pressuring a partner to do something sexually, which can range from unwanted kissing or touching to rape. This may also involve threatening someone in order to manipulate them into performing a sexual act, or pressuring them to allow explicit photos or videos of themselves to be taken that the abuser later uses as leverage to control the survivor. Sexual abuse is also restricting a survivor's access to birth control and condoms, forcing her to become pregnant or have an abortion, or repeatedly using sexual insults to demean a victim. Economic abuse is making or attempting to make an individual financially dependent on their abuser by maintaining total control over financial resources. It can involve forbidding one to work, forcing one to work without pay, controlling how money is spent, putting a partner on an allowance, misuse of someone's personal information to open credit cards, loans, or bank accounts, ruining one's credit, or withholding basic necessities like food, clothing, medication, and housing. Finally, there is spiritual abuse, also known as religious abuse. This includes forbidding a partner from practicing their moral or religious beliefs, or misusing religious scripture to instill fear, guilt, or subservience. This form of abuse may also include manipulating an individual to behave in a certain way, or making them believe abuse is part of a normal relationship and that divorce is not an option. An abuser may also justify abuse through religious scripture or convince the survivor that rewards exist in the afterlife for enduring abuse. If you speak with people who have endured abuse, more often than not, they will tell you their relationship started off well, or their abuser was perfectly charming at the outset of the relationship. Acts that start out as seemingly harmless or even gratifying, like wanting the victim to spend all their time only with them because they love them so much, can morph into abuse. The frequency and intensity of abuse varies. Abusers may apologize profusely for their actions, or try to convince a victim they do these things out of love or care, or that they just lost control temporarily. However, power and control almost always intensifies over time, despite any apologies, and often escalates into physical abuse that can become increasingly more violent. It can be difficult to understand why someone abuses someone else. Is it mental illness, anger management issues, life pressures, childhood exposure to domestic violence, or alcohol or drug use that causes someone to abuse? It is not. Instead, abuse is caused by one person's belief that they have the right to control their partner. And try as one may, the odds of an abuser changing or curtailing their behavior are extremely low. Domestic violence not only affects those who are abused, but also family, friends, co-workers, witnesses, and the community. Children that grow up witnessing domestic violence are among those most impacted. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs, is one of the largest investigations on this topic and has determined that frequent exposure to violence predisposes children to numerous social and physical problems. It teaches children violence is a normal way of life, therefore increasing their risk of becoming society's next generation of victims and abusers. These realities are why it is so important to understand what domestic violence is and what it looks like. It may help someone avoid an abusive partner altogether or identify the signs early enough to terminate a relationship before separation becomes complex. For those struggling with an abuser, the good news is there are a tremendous number of resources available to help you. In fact, there are close to 3,000 domestic violence shelters throughout the US and Canada, covering nearly every imaginable region. You can find the one nearest you at domesticshelters.org, which offers its millions of visitors a year a searchable database of shelters, along with their contact information. Most local shelters offer a 24/7 hotline staffed with advocates who understand what you are going through and how to help. Additionally, there is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which you can reach at 800-799-7233. You can call 24/7 or use their live chat feature online, both of which are anonymous, to speak with an advocate. There's also a hotline specifically for young people at 866-331-9474. More than 4 million people have called into these two national hotlines, which are free, just like local hotlines. If you're not quite ready to speak with someone and would rather learn about and process what you're going through, there are hundreds of articles, sorted by category, on a wide variety of topics at domesticshelters.org. Articles include how to create a safety plan, how to secure an order of protection, why you should document abuse, how to explain abuse to children, what to do if you have to go to court, how to heal after leaving an abuser, and more potentially life-saving topics. The website also lists recommended books and offers links to a number of self-assessments that can be taken privately to better understand a situation and your level of danger. By the way, as you explore domestic violence further, you'll likely hear the term survivor used in place of what others might refer to as a victim. Survivor is an empowering term domestic violence advocates, people currently experiencing abuse, and people who have successfully moved on from an abuser like to use because of what it implies. Above all, always remember, abuse is never your fault. You do not deserve to be with a partner who makes you feel unsafe or who harms you physically or emotionally. It is also up to you and you alone to decide when the safest time is to leave your abuser and plan your escape.
So there are different types of intimate partner violence. There's physical violence, like the video said, which is the intentional use of physical force with the potential of causing death, disability, injury, or harm. Examples include grabbing, choking, shoving, slapping, hitting, biting, kicking, punching, stabbing, shooting, or restraining. Sexual violence is divided into 3 categories: the use of force to compel or coerce a person to engage in a sexual act against his or her will, the attempted or completed sexual act involving a person who is unable to understand the nature of the condition of the act, to decline participation, or to communicate unwillingness to engage in the sexual act. And then there's abuse of sexual contact. Examples include rape, treating a person in a sexually derogatory manner, accusations of infidelity, withholding sex, control over condom and contraceptive usage, forced termination of pregnancy or premature birth of a baby. And then there's also threats of physical or sexual violence, where the individual uses words, gestures, or weapons to communicate that there is a threat to cause death, disability, injury, or physical harm. There is psychological violence, which involves trauma to the victim caused by acts, threats of acts, or coercive tactics. These can include humiliating them, controlling the victim, deliberately making the survivor feel diminished or embarrassed, isolating the individual from family or friends, threatening self-harm or suicide, and stalking. And then there's economic violence, which is an attempt to make the victim financially dependent on the abuser, or vice versa, that person's dependent on the abusee, so they feel kind of like a sense of responsibility for taking care of them, like if I leave, he's not going to be able to take care of himself, or vice versa. Examples can include maintaining control over financial resources, including the victim's earned income, resources received through public assistance or Social Security, withholding money or access to money, and forbidding attendance to school or employment.
Emotional abuse is another tactic on the power and control wheel. This particular form of abuse is something that happens usually more often than the physical violence does, because it's his way of getting her to understand that she's less than. He believes in his head that he has a right to dominate her. He believes that he's superior to her. He wants her to believe the same thing, and part of how he gets her to believe he's superior is by constantly putting her down. So the kitchen's never clean enough. The dishes are never done the right way. The kids are never disciplined correctly. You don't even go to the store on the right road. It takes you too long to get to the kids' school and back again. I mean, there's literally nothing that she does right, and he's constantly using emotional abuse as a way to get her to believe that not only isn't she worthy, but literally she couldn't survive on her own without him. That she needs his superior thinking abilities in order to even survive. This has come to me many times when working with men who are violent and then talking to their partners. And an example would be a woman who raised 6 children on her own. He literally didn't do anything to help raise these kids. He didn't even work. She held the job. She made the money. And when he first was put in jail and she was alone with these kids, her response was, "I don't think I can possibly make it without him. He contributes so much." Now, as advocates, the advocates knew that that wasn't the case. They knew that she was running this house and keeping it together, and that he was really detracting from all of it. But she didn't know that, because he had so convinced her, so diminished her, that she didn't believe in herself. Now, 8 months later, when he's still in jail, she comes into the building and says, I don't think I actually need him in the house. I make the money. I raise my kids. I attend to all their needs. I'm not sure what he's actually done in the last 10 years to contribute to this home. She came to that understanding once she had the space to actually prove to herself that she could make it. So this emotional abuse takes the form of a lot of name calling, not just putting her down and her choices down, but also name calling. So I've read police reports for years and years and years, hundreds of police reports. I've yet to come across a police report where an officer is interviewing a man who has beaten his partner, and he refers to her by her given name. He refers to her as a cunt, a whore, a bitch, a slut, all these different names, but never her name. And when we work with men in class in a rehabilitation effort, one of the group rules is that they have to call their partners by their name. There are men in class who refuse to participate because they will not use her given name, because it's a point of respect, and they can't extend that to their partners because they don't believe that she's actually equal to them. This is the depth of that entitlement, that dominance that they carry into the home and into their relationships with women. So, although the women say that the hitting causes a great deal of fear and a great deal of pain, it's the emotional abuse, that constant diminishment of who they are as women, and the name calling that gets associated with it, that is some of the hardest for the women to overcome, because they literally lose themselves in this notion that they are something other than who they believed they were before they met him.
I would just like to add at the end of that video, he spoke a lot to women who experience emotional abuse, but men, the most common abuse that they experience is emotional abuse, and they experience it at a little bit of a higher rate than women. And I believe the statistic is 43% of men and 42% of women will experience emotional abuse in their lifetime, and that actually like breaks down to like 1 out of every 2 to 3 people when you're looking at, you know, half of a population. So
That's a good point for anything in this PowerPoint, is that most of it's going to be geared towards women, but men experience it as well, just maybe in different forms, and they're less likely to speak out about it because
it's much more stigmatized for
yeah,
men to speak out, especially in our culture.
and especially if their abusing partners are women.
Yep.
So what are the consequences of intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence affects women's physical and mental health through direct pathways such as injury and indirect pathways such as chronic health problems that can arise from prolonged periods of stress. A history of experienced violence is therefore a risk factor for many diseases and conditions. I think I have an article somewhere, hopefully I have it in the supplemental stuff, that kind of breaks that down for you. Current research suggests that the influence of abuse can persist long after the violence has stopped, and the more severe the abuse, the greater its impact on a woman's physical and mental health. It says woman's, but it's the same thing for men as well. And the impact over time of different types and multiple episodes of abuse appears to be cumulative.
What does that mean when it says it appears to be
Cumulative? Like it builds
Yes.
up.
So like every
adds up.
instance of violence creates like a bigger possibility for this.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like the more you eat french fries, the more likely you are to get a clogged artery. And the more likely you have a clogged artery, you're going to have a heart attack.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow, glad you're here. I just found out that one of my best friends was in an abusive relationship for so long, and none of us knew anything about it. I'm heartbroken. I thought we told each other everything. Maybe if I had spoken up, she would have talked to me about it sooner. So, here goes. Intimate partner violence, sometimes called teen dating violence or domestic violence, is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. An intimate partner is a person's boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, or lover. Intimate partner violence may include different kinds of abuse. Physical abuse may include hitting, kicking, punching, or other kinds of physical violence. Emotional abuse may not include physical violence, but it can be equally as harmful. When someone is abused emotionally, they may be called names, humiliated, yelled at, or made to feel intimidated. The abuser may try to control the other person by telling them what to do, what to wear, or where they can and cannot go. Financial abuse is when a person tries to control and limit their partner's access to money so that the partner will be dependent on them. One example would be if the person discouraged or disallowed the partner to work and make their own money. Another is if the person takes the partner's money or credit cards and refuses to give them back. Another form of abuse is known as stalking and harassment. Stalking or harassing someone may include spying on them or following them around and constantly showing up where they are or refusing to leave when asked. Stalking also can include sending harassing or unwanted emails, texts, or posts. Finally, there is partner abuse that involves sexual abuse. This type of violence is when a person forces their partner to participate in sexual acts or behaviors without their consent or ignores the partner's sexual boundaries. Just because a person is in an intimate relationship with someone doesn't mean that they must have sex with them or do sexual things that they find uncomfortable or demeaning. If you or someone you know is being abused in a relationship, it's important to know that it's never the fault of the abused person, and it's important to ask for help. To get help, you can talk to the school counselor, a social worker, or another trusted adult. A great resource if you need information, support, or advice is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can check out their website at www.thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-7233. Remember, domestic violence is not love. Someone who really loves you wouldn't try to physically harm you, control you, make you feel bad about yourself, or force you to do something that you don't want to do. A loving and healthy relationship is about consent, respect, and honoring who you are as an individual.
Till next time, don't forget to visit me at amaze.org or go to my YouTube channel to watch more. Bye!
That YouTube channel, by the way, amaze.org, has lots of great videos on lots of different topics if you want to check those out. Like you can just see here, there's some on like feelings and so you think you're pregnant and birth control. They have some really good ones. Children's immediate reactions to intimate partner violence may include generalized anxiety, sleeplessness, nightmares, difficulty concentrating, high activity levels, increased aggression, increased anxiety about being separated from a parent, so they're like kind of worried, and then worry about their own safety or the safety of their parent. Long-term effects, especially from chronic exposure to intimate partner violence for children, may include physical health problems, behavioral problems in adolescence, such as delinquency from school, truancy, just regular delinquency, alcohol or substance abuse, emotional difficulties in adulthood, such as PTSD, depression, anxiety. Exposure to IPV has also been linked to poor academic performance. Children who grow up in IPV may have an impaired ability to concentrate, difficulty completing schoolwork, lower scores on verbal, motor, and social skills. In addition to these physical, behavioral, psychological, and cognitive effects, children who have been exposed to IPV often learn destructive lessons about the use of violence and power in relationships. Children may learn that it is acceptable to exert control or relieve stress by using violence, or that violence is in some way linked to expressions of intimacy and affection. So that violence becomes normalized for them, and so they think that that's how you're supposed to express when you're upset or angry or when you love someone. These lessons can have a powerful negative effect on children in social situations and relationships throughout childhood and later in life. Once those things have been normalized for them, they're going to probably seek out relationships similar to what they've experienced growing up because that's what they know. As with other trauma types, children's responses to IPV vary with age and developmental stage. In addition, children's responses depend on the severity of violence, their proximity to the violent event, so like if they've witnessed it or how close they were to it, and the responses of their caregivers.
I would also add that it makes them more susceptible to abusive relationships because they don't understand red flags. So the early red flags in an abusive relationship usually has to do with like control and emotional abuse. And so when they've seen like a controlling parent or they've seen like name calling and stuff in their house, it becomes normal and they don't see it as an issue. And then by the time there is an issue, it's a much bigger issue.
Yeah. So this chart has broken down reactions by age groups. So from birth to age 5, sleep or eating disruptions are normal. Lack or withdrawal from responsiveness, intense separation anxiety, inconsolable crying, developmental regression, so like acting at a younger age than they actually are, loss of acquired skills, so like if one day they're talking and then one day they're not, or walking or whatever, intense anxiety, worries and or new fears, increased aggression and or impulsive behavior. From 6 to 11, nightmares or sleep disturbances, aggression and difficulty with peers in relationships, peer relationships in school, so like getting along with their classmates or friends, difficulty concentrating and task completion in school, withdrawal or emotional numbing, school avoidance and or school or truancy, and then from 12 to 18, antisocial behaviors, failing in school, impulsive or reckless behavior such as truancy, substance abuse, running away, involvement in also abusive or violent relationships, anxiety, depression, and withdrawal. It is important to remember that these symptoms can also be associated with other stressors, traumas, or developmental disturbances, and they should be considered in the context of the child and the family's functioning. So like in birth age to 5, one of the reactions is a regression or a loss of acquired skills. If that happens, it can be normal for domestic violence, but it could also be a sign that there's something medically or developmentally wrong with the child, and it may be important to at least roll those medical reasons for that reaction before assuming that it's just, I'm in a domestic violence situation, it's normal. Children and youth exposed to domestic violence. All children and youth who live on domestic violence are affected by the experience. The nature and extent to the effects vary greatly. Some children are severely traumatized, while others are able to cope well and go on to live healthy and productive lives. Children are not just eyewitnesses to domestic violence. They are actively involved in trying to understand the abuse, predict when it will happen, protect themselves and their parent, their siblings, or whomever is in their surroundings, and worry about the consequences. Fear and secrecy dominate family relationships, and survival becomes the primary goal of the non-abusing family members. The focus on making it through each day may leave little room for a child to be a child and have fun and relax, or even contemplate meeting their basic needs and planning for their future.
I'm going to talk about how domestic violence impacts children. Unfortunately, children are the unwilling victims sometimes of domestic violence, that although it's about the partners and the adults involved, it's the children that are around that are also very hurt by whatever is going on. There's a lot of things that influence how a child reacts to a domestic violence situation. Certainly there's the kind of violence and their proximity to it. So there's certainly a difference between a child who maybe was in their bedroom and had headphones on while parents were arguing, and that's maybe very different than a child who was right there when somebody violently murdered or abused a partner or a parent. So again, there's the situation itself and what the child witnessed that may be different. There's the severity of the kind of violence that will impact how a child is affected by what happened. Their age, certainly young children may not understand it, but they may be reacting much more to things that they hear or see because they don't have the language. Then you also want to think about the child's own temperament, their intelligence, their style. Some are more anxious. Some have a harder time. They may have other emotional problems or learning problems that are going along with the situation. And then also it's their perception of how in danger they were at the time. So they may feel very scared for themselves as well as protective or scared of the other people. And lastly, sometimes there's the after effects of the violence. Did children have to relocate? Did they change who they were living with? All those things may pile up and make it an even more overwhelming situation for the child. Now, in general, some children really, there's a range in terms of the reactions that children display afterwards. They may have a much more difficult time with their behaviors. They may regress. They may fight. They may show signs of withdrawal and depression. They may be acting out. They may be thinking things that you don't know in terms of being worried or afraid. And they may feel tense, anxious, upset, nervous, worried that something else will happen. So there's a lot of things that you have to pay attention to and understand might be going on for your child. And lastly, the thing we certainly worry about the most is some children that have been in a domestic violence situation will develop possibly a traumatic reaction. And that's where they may re-experience what happened in their mind and their thoughts and in their dreams and nightmares. Or they may feel on edge and aroused and always wondering and worrying that something bad will happen. And they're sometimes hyper alert and thinking about what's going to happen next. Or their body feels ready for something terrible to happen. And then they may avoid situations or people. So again, the relationship that they have with the people that are involved in the violence can have an impact on how they're functioning and how they go on. Domestic violence is about what happens that's domestic in terms of the family, and violence in terms of what the children are learning and watching and reacting to. They often need help with their reactions and how to manage the relationships with those people that were involved in the violence.
In case you're curious, by the way, I'm a pretty good judge of horseflesh. When you've been doing this as long as I have, you get where you pretty good read of people, right? And this is not an evil guy.
I know that.
He's not. He's not an evil guy. He's not even a malicious guy. He's an alcoholic, and most of what he does when he shouldn't do it, he's probably drunk, or at least in some way under the influence. He's emotionally immature, and so he just does things in the heat of the moment when he's in pain that inflict a lot of pain. Mm-hmm. And there's an old game people play called "Get Them Before They Get Me," and if he starts feeling like you're kind of crowding in on him and you're going to start causing him to look at things that he doesn't want to look at, then he starts calling you leaping, yes, and leaping at, and blah, 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 and then medicates himself with alcohol so he doesn't have to think about it. How am I doing? Very well. So why would you want a guy like that? Because that's not the guy that he is. This is part of the guy that he is. Here's the problem. You say, okay, I get that. So we agree, Dr. Phil. Yeah, well, we agree with that. What we don't agree with is that you have the right to subject your children to that while he's working it out, because you absolutely unequivocally do not. And having been trained in forensic psychology and worked as an officer of the court in custody environments and situations, if this situation came before me, you would be in real jeopardy with all of these children involved here. Somebody would step in and say, look, these people don't have the right to abuse these children. Because if you're abusing the mother, you're abusing the children. If you're abusing the father, you're abusing the children. Children that watch this go on are changed in a meaningful way. They're more at risk to be in volatile relationships themselves. They're more at risk for using and abusing drugs. They're more at risk for academic underachievement. They're more at risk for teen pregnancy. Other than that, I don't see any problems here. You said, I hope this isn't affecting the children. It is affecting the children. It affects who they are. It affects what they say to themselves, and they're at risk for all the things that I just listed. They deserve better than that, which means you got to put a spine in and stand up and say, this will not happen. You want to be in my life? you straighten your act up. This needs to stop.
Children are exposed to domestic violence in many different ways. Seeing their parent or caregiver being threatened, demeaned, or battered, being in the middle of an assault by accident because the abuser intends for the child to be involved, or because the child tries to intervene, overhearing a conflict or the battering, seeing the aftermath such as injuries or trauma reactions, living in a household dominated by tension and fear, being raised by parents whose ability to care for them is compromised by domestic violence, being used and manipulated by the abuser to hurt the battered parent, the battered parent, so like being used as a pawn, and suffering the consequences of economic abuse. So like if the parent's like, if the person's being financially abusive and they're like, I'm not going to give you money to go buy the kid diapers or formula or something that they need or want. Effects of exposure to domestic violence can include believing that the abuse is their fault, turning against the caregiver, or being ambivalent to feelings about both, or having ambivalent feelings about both parents or caregivers, feeling that they are alone, that there is no one who understands them, being afraid to talk about the abuse or express their feelings, developing negative core beliefs about themselves and others, developing unhealthy coping and survival reactions such as mental health and behavioral problems, believing that the world is dangerous and it is a dangerous and unpredictable place, being isolated from people who might find out about the abuse or offer help. Children and youth also learn lessons such as violence and coercion are normal and justifiable. Abuse tactics are effective ways to get what you want. There are two ways to solve problems: aggressive and passivity. Victims or survivors are responsible for what happens to them. People who hurt others don't have to face consequences for their actions. It's okay to blame problems on somebody else. People who are supposed to take care of you cannot always be trusted. And women are not always worthy of respect. And that could be in other genders and identity roles as well, that just people in general are not worthy of respect. For teenagers 13 to 18, older children may exhibit the most behavioral changes as the result of exposure to violence. Depending on their circumstances, teenagers may talk about the event all the time or deny that it happened, refuse to follow rules or talk back with greater frequency, complain about being tired all the time, engage in more risky behaviors, sleep more or less than usual, increase in aggressive behaviors, want to be alone or not wanting to spend time with friends, experience frequent nightmares, use drugs or alcohol, run away from home, or get in trouble with the law. Externalized symptoms of children's exposure to domestic violence include aggression, lower social competence, including like having less empathy for others, lower verbal, cognitive, and motor abilities, restlessness, impulsivity, and difficulty concentrating, behavioral and academic difficulties in school, immaturity, delays in development, and a regression to earlier developmental stages. Internalized symptoms of children's exposure to domestic violence include depression, anxiety or hypervigilance, fear, withdrawn or inhibited behavior, lower self-esteem, shame, feeling responsible for the abuse, and then also some mental disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder can form. Warning signs of domestic violence in relationships include isolation of the victim, intimidation and violence, using children as weapons, verbally abusive, damaging relationships, minimizing abuse, attacking property or pets, substance abuse, stalking partner or an ex-partner, extreme jealousy, controlling behavior, rape or the force or use of force in sex, a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde effect, which is where like they're really, really, really nice when they're like out in public to like fool the world into thinking that like they're this really great person, but then behind closed doors they're Mr. Hyde, And because there's such a great person out in the community, nobody would ever, like, people would think, like, if you said something, oh, that can't be true, like, he's so nice, he does this, he does that, there's no way he does that at home. Or vice versa for others. The use of privilege, spiritual or religious abuse, and then a history of violence.
When people think of abuse, they often equate it to physical violence, but that isn't where abuse starts or ends. Abuse can be physical, mental, or emotional, and everything in between. It is important to understand what constitutes as abuse and what you can do about it if you come to the realization that you are being abused. What follows is a list of 10 red flags you might run into if you are in an abusive relationship. This list is not meant to be the only red flags of abuse, and if you feel that you are being abused, please seek out help. There will be a short list of resources in the description for this video. Number 1. Controlling behavior. In many abusive relationships, the abuser will want to control every aspect of their victim's life. They might want to know who their victim is talking to, who they are planning to meet up with, or where they are going. This can even flow into them controlling what their victim wears, how their makeup looks, or how they carry themselves. Number 2. Humiliates you. This behavior is often done in front of other people, perhaps his or her friends, and is used as a way to keep their victim down. The abuser's goal is to make them feel weak and small so that the victim doesn't stand up for themselves. Number 3. Guilt trips. This is a method employed by abusers when they want to get their way. They might say something like, "If you loved me, you would or wouldn't do this," or "I thought this meant something to you, but apparently I was wrong." The hope is that the victim will feel bad for letting their abuser down and just give in to whatever it is they want. Number 4. Forces you to take responsibility for their feelings. The abuser will use this tactic as a form of manipulation. They may say, "You make me angry," or "You've done this, you've done that," as a way to make their victim feel responsible for anything bad. This is meant to push that victim to work on making the abuser happy at all times. The abuser wants to keep their victim in line, and making them feel like it's all their fault helps the abuser control their victim's actions. Number 5. Ultimatums. With ultimatums, the abuser is trying to get what they want by force without laying hands on their victim. With an ultimatum, the abuser might hold something over their victim's head, perhaps a child or even their home, in an attempt to gain absolute control over the situation. The abuser might say something like, "If you go out with your friends, I'll take away your credit cards," or "If you leave me, I'll kill myself." Number 6. Physical violence. If the abuser can't get their way with words, they can and will resort to violence. This can start off as small things like holding their victim's arms during an argument and lead up to completely beating their victim or even killing them. Hitting, choking, tripping, pushing, or throwing things are all forms of physical violence in a relationship. Number 7. A bad temper. The abuser might have a short fuse or just blow up over something that doesn't look like a big deal to anyone else. This isn't just a symptom of having anger issues, it is also yet another form of manipulation. The goal of this is to scare the victim into being subservient and obedient by doing anything they can to stop their abuser from getting angry. Number 8. Forces you to do things you don't want to do. This can mean anything from making you go to the movies when you'd rather stay home, to making you do something physically that you don't want to do. It is another way for the abuser to gain control over their victim. Some might even find pleasure in watching their victim feel uncomfortable. Number 9. Constantly checks up on you. An abuser might employ this as a way of keeping their victim in line. They may demand that their victim text them at certain intervals while they are out, and can even request that the victim send specific pictures, like them holding up a peace sign or a selfie with the friend they said they were with. Number 10. Picking a fight. An abuser might do this to test your limits. They will want to know how far they can take a fight and see what all you might be willing to apologize for. They won't take responsibility for anything and will instead make you feel as if it was all your fault. Once the fight is over, they may forgive you right away, or they may keep up a cold facade to see what you might do to win back their favor. If you feel like you might be in an abusive relationship, please seek help. If you are actively being abused, call 911 as soon as you can and report it. There are also many options based on where you live as well. There are some links in the description for this video. So, what are your thoughts? Be sure to comment below if you want to see more content like this, and please subscribe to see more videos from Psych2Go. Thanks for watching.
Hey everybody, I just want to give a personal thank you video for you.
Skip that.
Imagine you're in a restaurant. A couple is sitting at the next table, when all of a sudden, you overhear this conversation. From the moment I saw you, I knew you were the one. Marry me. I will treat you like a queen. Say yes. We've only been dating a few weeks. Yes? I've heard this before. This is moving fast. Is there a sign here of an abusive relationship? Their relationship is just beginning. But let's step away from our couple for a moment. Did you know, according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, nearly 50% of intimate relationships experience some form of domestic violence. When we think about domestic violence, we typically think about someone being beaten up. But not always. As the founder of a global organization in support of shelters for victims of abuse, I get asked to speak at fundraising events on a regular basis. Now, think of a time when you donated to a charity. Why did you do it? A part of you wants to be a hero. You want to help and make a difference. But what if the problem your donation is supposed to fix is simply getting worse? What do? About a year ago, I spoke at a fundraiser for a local shelter, and after accepting the donation, the representative of the shelter said, "We will always need more beds. We will always need more shelters. And we will always need more money. Because the problem is getting worse." What? How can that be? I thought to myself, with all the awareness today, how is it getting worse? Why, in spite of all of our efforts, is domestic violence increasing? More importantly, how do we turn this around? So what exactly is domestic violence? It is defined as a pattern of behavior used by one partner to maintain power and control over another in an intimate relationship. For the last 9 years, I've been running an annual global fundraising event. It takes place in hundreds of cities around the world to support domestic violence shelters. It involves the work and participation of thousands of people every year. And now, to my complete shock, I was hearing we were not making any real difference in lowering the statistics. Were we doing this for nothing? Of course not. Shelters are necessary and continue to need our support. But by the time a person gets into a shelter, the physical abuse has already occurred. And some don't make it to a shelter. They go straight to the cemetery. It's true. Domestic violence is increasing everywhere, including the country you live in right now. Abuse does not discriminate. And when we look closer, we can see the signs. Let's return to our couple for a moment. A year has gone by since their dinner date. Imagine now we go behind closed doors, and just like a fly on the wall, we hear this. Oh yes, he's so wonderful. He loves me so much. You should see our home. It's full of gifts he's been showering me with since we first started dating. I can't wait for you to meet him. Okay, thank you. Bye. Honey, my friend Angie's invited us to dinner. We're not going anywhere. I want you all to myself, okay? But I haven't seen Angie in over a year, and she's my best friend. In my research, I've learned of one very important pattern. When you see the signs, you can see pattern. In domestic violence, physical abuse is almost always preceded by emotional abuse. When you see the signs, you can see the pattern. And if we can interrupt that pattern, we can prevent the physical abuse. And yes, there is abuse happening in our couple. The warning signs we've seen here are the rushing into commitments. Marry me only after a few weeks of dating. The showering of gifts, also known as love bombing. The isolation and control, not being allowed to spend time with friends. And we've only scratched the surface. Add to these controlling your behavior, threatening to leave, or to commit suicide if you leave, criticizing what you do, wear, or think. And there are many more signs, most of which go unnoticed, unless you know what they are. When I first started my annual global fundraising event, I was in an abusive relationship. Ironically, I had no clue. I did not know that constantly walking on eggshells around my partner was a symptom of emotional abuse. I did not know that having to agree with everything he said, because he would tolerate no less, was emotional abuse. And I did not know that being made to feel like there was something very wrong with me because nothing I did would please him was emotional abuse. He'd get angry, break things. And as his anger increased, he'd come closer and closer, cornering me till I could feel his breath on my face, his hands on my shoulders, moving up to my neck, threatening. Am I going to die? Is today the day he's going to kill me? And you know what? I didn't care. I was so emotionally worn down that I simply did not care. But to the outside world, I had a great relationship. I was happy, or so I convinced myself and everyone else. One day while all this was happening, I managed to reconnect with an old friend, and over coffee, I confided in her. I said, I dread going home. He lectures me. He blames me for everything bad that happens to him. and then makes me feel guilty for things that I have no control over. Nothing I do pleases him. I feel like a total failure. My friend looked deep into my eyes, and she whispered, Francesca, do you not realize you're in an abusive relationship? No. No. It's not like that. No. He loves me. You know what? Everything's fine. It's me. But in the days that followed, whenever he did something, I could no longer ignore it. My friend helped me open my eyes. She helped me see the signs. She broke the spell I was under. Had she not, I may not be standing in front of you today. With help, I was able to get myself out safely. Not everyone is so lucky. Many in similar situations never manage to leave. They end up in a morgue. My friend is a hero to me for helping me see the signs. When you learn the signs, you will see that they're all around you. They may even be part of your own life. Understand the signs of emotional abuse for what they are. Huge, flashing, warning signals. When you know the signs, you can help somebody. You can be a hero in someone else's life, and perhaps even your own. Don't wait until someone has to tell you what has become obvious to everyone but you. Don't wait until you sink so low that you don't care about yourself anymore. See the signs. Take a few moments to learn the signs of emotional abuse. Break the pattern. If you are in an abusive relationship, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline for guidance. Do it today. Do it for yourself. And if you have children, do it for them. Be a hero. When you know someone in an abusive situation, gently guide them, gently guide them and help them recognize what is happening. Be supported, like my friend. Be there for them. We can turn this around. See the signs. Break the pattern. Be a hero.
So there are some individual risk factors for becoming an abuser. Some of the most consistent factors are associated with a person's likelihood of becoming committing violence against their partners are at young age, low level of education, witnessing or experiencing violence as a child, harmful use of alcohol or drugs, personality disorders, the acceptance of violence, feeling it is acceptable for someone to harm others, and a past history of abusing other partners. Factors consistently... Okay, so that was for men. And this one's for women. Factors consistently associated with women's increased likelihood of experiencing violence by a partner is a low education status, exposure to violence between parents, sexual abuse during childhood, acceptance of violence, and exposure to other forms of prior abuse. So that first bullet point is actually the likelihood of becoming an abuser, and then the second one is experiencing. And I think those would actually go for both genders, and it was just typed to reflect gender identity from the article that was received for this PowerPoint. So what are the effects of domestic violence? Witnessing can mean seeing the actual incidents of physical or sexual abuse. It can be hearing the threats or fighting noises in the other room, breaking of glass, etc. Children may also observe the aftermath of physical abuse, such as blood, bruises, tears, torn clothing, broken items. And finally, children may be aware of the tension in the home, such as if their mother is fearless when the abuser's car pulls into the driveway. Those kids can pick up on things easier than we give them credit for. How domestic abuse affects children and families. Domestic abuse affects children and families in lots of different ways. Even if children are not being physically abused themselves, the National Child Trauma Stress Network explains that some of the many ways that children can be impacted, that abuse can impact kids and families include children can exhibit behavior problems, including tantrums, difficulty sleeping, and violent or abusive behavior. They may have problems both at home and in school if they witness abuse in the home. Children can become clingy or fearful. They may be especially clingy with the partner who was victimized after each incident of abuse occurs. Children may become involved in drugs or may drink or use drugs to cope with witnessing or experiencing abuse. And kids who grow up in violent homes are more likely to abuse substances. Children may feel responsible for fixing their family. Abuse changes the family dynamics and can result in kids feeling responsible for caring for a parent or solving the problems of the family to resolve those abusive behaviors. These are some of the ways kids can be impacted. Children can experience short-term consequences of witnessing domestic violence. Often with the right support and therapy, they are very resilient and can recover easily and quickly from witnessing the abuse once the behavior comes to an end. The consequences of family violence. Domestic violence and child abuse are truly deemed like family violence, and that exposures that create and maintain a vicious cycle. Exposed children are more likely to become involved in IPV throughout adolescence and adulthood as both either victims or perpetrators, and even sometimes both. Research shows that boys who witness domestic violence are twice as likely to abuse their own partners and children when they become adults. There are also established links between child abuse and criminal behavior later in life. Children who have experienced abuse are 9 times more likely to be involved in criminal activities. Abused children have a higher risk of exhibiting violent behaviors. Research has shown that child abuse victims are more likely to perpetrate youth violence, up to 6.6% for females and 11.9% for males, and young adult IPV. Those statistics are 4.4% for females and 17.2% for males. Family violence, whether physical, sexual, emotional, or verbal, is one of the most direct and potentially harmful forms of violence exposure that children experience due to its unique nature. It is usually not a sudden, isolated incident, but rather may involve years of emotional, psychological, and physical trauma that can escalate over time. A child can be an indirect victim or a secondary victim of intimate partner violence as a witness and still face the serious consequences of the abuse.
I'd like to remind you that the statistics that we have are based on what's reported. And because of the stigma that's associated with male abuse survivors and the fact that our society doesn't really recognize emotional abuse. When women are being emotionally abusive towards men, it's kind of normal in our society. I think that some of these are kind of skewed. And I just want to remind you that men can be victims too.
Yeah. Children affected by domestic violence. Not all children exposed to violence are affected equally or in the same ways. For many children, the exposure to domestic violence may be traumatic, and their reactions are similar to the reactions to children's reactions of other traumatic stressors. So each child and situation is going to be unique.
A child who lives with domestic violence lives in darkness. She sees things no child should see, and hears things no child should hear. She struggles to separate her nightmares from reality because there's very little difference. The child who lives with domestic violence isn't afraid of the dark. She's afraid of her dad because the monster doesn't live in her closet. It's just down the hall. And when she grows up, she'll be more likely to be abused. And her brother, he'll be twice as likely to become a monster himself because that's the world they know. When a woman lives with domestic violence, she's completely devastated because the person she should be able to turn to has turned on her. And she thought he'd change once they got married, had a child, or when he got a better job. But he never did. And she's tried to make things better, but she can't make him stop. So when she locks the door at night, she's not keeping danger out, she's keeping it in. And she feels hopeless, ashamed, and completely trapped. When a woman lives with domestic violence, she hears voices. And she feels completely alone. But she's not the only one. Maybe you don't live with domestic violence. Maybe you don't wake up every day shaking or jump every time the phone rings. But maybe you should look a little harder. Maybe it's a friend, a coworker, or your neighbor. And maybe you could offer support, a number to call, or point to a way out. Your help could make all the difference. We need everyone to bring domestic violence into the light.
Welcome back to Creating Cooperative Kids. I'm your host, Bill Corbett. Domestic violence is a crime involving a pattern of abusive behavior in intimate relationships where one partner tries to control and dominate the other. The behavior may be physically, sexually, psychologically, or verbally abusive, with the victim left feeling scared, confused, dependent, and insecure. Now, the children of a battered parent must contend with these same fears and realities. With me in the studio today is Annalisa Deal, youth advocate with the Network Against Domestic Abuse. Welcome, Annalisa.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming in. Now, where this show will probably be airing, it's going to be Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is why we want to do this segment to help get the word out. And of course, I'm a parent educator, so I'm calling on you to help us clearly understand what happens with parenting skills in domestic violence situations. Now, I would assume that we're going to talk about both when the victim may still be at home, may still be in the environment, and equally, even when they're in safety, when they're in a shelter. It's still a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, you see a lot of, it's hard in this situation because the person who's a victim in this situation puts so much of their efforts and thoughts and energy into whatever will keep the abuser fine and not doing any harm. So a lot of times you'll see perfectly good parents who love their kids, who know how to discipline their kids, who would have everything otherwise right, but since they're in this situation where they're going through so much personally and then dealing with another person where they have to think of every action they do and what it's going to make that person do, a lot of them just don't think as much about their kids, so you see a lot of neglect in these situations, even though they don't really mean to.
One of the things that I tell parents when I do my lectures and my workshops is I've come up with a list of the top 10 causes of misbehavior. One of them, number 10, which I should put on number 1 spot, is misbehavior can actually be a direct result of of adult emotional chaos going on around the child. And that can be the mom's fighting with her mother-in-law, to the parents fighting, to whatever, including domestic violence. That is adult emotional chaos. And that's got to be the ultimate, because, as you indicate, the victim is so lost in the terror, in the pain, that they sometimes forget about the children. And I would imagine some may even think, well, that's my child. They're not, daddy's fine with her.
Yeah.
So but they don't realize they're aware of all this stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, I would imagine, in my experience working with victims of domestic violence, they're like, why is my child misbehaving? What's going on here? That's making my situation even worse, right?
Yeah. And it happens a lot because sometimes the child might pick up on some of the same habits as the abuser because they'll see that it works for them. Or sometimes parents will think that the kids aren't seeing what's going on. But then when you ask the kid what happened, they can give you almost more details than the parents told you about what happened.
They're so in tune. Just because the child doesn't necessarily see it or in the right room, they can feel it. I'm convinced that even though the umbilical cord was cut when the child was born, I think there remains an emotional umbilical cord between especially mother and child, and the child can feel what's going on. And of course, children don't have the ability to say, gee, Mom, I'm getting some sort of feelings that you're like suffering from anxiety. What's going on? They don't do that. They pick fights with their siblings. They're not cooperative, and that's the direct result. But I have to ask you, what I think may be one of the leading questions that people have about DV, why do the victims stay in the relationships? Because I think we see a lot of them do.
Yeah, and I think that's a big question in general that people always wonder. But a lot of people have to take into consideration that there's so many reasons that anyone stays in a relationship, even if it's not abusive. It's hard to figure out what's really normal and what's not. I think the question that comes into terms, especially with parenting and abuse, is people think, why would you put your child through that because it's unsafe? When a lot of times to the parent, staying might be the more safe option. Like you'll hear from males that are victims that they wanted to stay in the relationship because males are less likely to win custody over the child, and if I'm not there, is she going to treat the child the same way she treated me since there's nobody to take it out on? Or women might stay in the situation because they're financially dependent on the abuser and kind of isolated, because those are some of the primary things they use, and then they think, if I leave, that I'm going to be homeless and my kids will be out on the street. Would it be better for them to stay with an abuser who's not hurting them, just hurting me?
I think one of the things that we as adults suffer from is we get comfortable with our surroundings, where we are, who we're with, and it's hard to imagine not having that, even when it's an abusive situation, because people, we read so many books that empower us, encourage us, and say, you can do anything you want. You can make anything happen. But somehow that's easier said than done. And I would imagine, especially in a domestic violence situation, like you said, they're afraid, I won't have anywhere to live. Where am I going to go? And it's so hard to get them past that, right?
Yeah.
So what are some things that we can offer parents or people who know of parents in this kind of situation?
I think one of the biggest things to offer is just support, because a lot of the times some of the things that keep them back from getting help are believing that either they're in it completely alone and nobody's there to help them, or they might think that nobody's going to believe them. So having somebody that's willing to listen and try and understand their point of view and work with them to offer support and find the help that they're willing to get. Because a lot of people also try sometimes to push people for certain things, like saying, well, why don't you just leave? And when you get that negativity, it's kind of hard to really be like, oh yeah, this person's right, I should just go do that. It's that easy. So I think just offering them support and kind of trying to take a step back to understand where they're coming from a little bit.
What does support look like, though? When you say support, what does that mean? You mean take them in your home? Means give them money? What does that mean?
I think it can mean a number of different things. For some people, the most important thing is just listening to them and letting them talk to you, or it could be giving them a phone number for somewhere they can call for help, or maybe they don't know where to go because they can't like figure out how to start off somewhere new. Well, maybe you know somebody in a different area that could help them with the job or help them find a place or something.
But what do you do if you know of someone who's in that situation and they put on plenty of makeup? You hear the violence going on, but yet they won't admit that it's going on. What would you say? What would you recommend to people who are aware of potentially of something going on?
I think it's hard to figure out what to do in that situation because we want to kind of just be like blunt and straightforward with people, but sometimes there's a lot of reason why the people might be hiding it. Like maybe they're really afraid if somebody finds out that could mean like death for them or something serious. So it might be important for them to keep it quiet. And in that case, I think trying to offer support that's maybe not as straightforward, like maybe a palm card or maybe inviting them somewhere where they'll learn more information, or maybe just asking a couple of questions to see if they'll come out with it on their own, letting them know that you're safe to talk to. Because if you ask a couple like beginner questions like, oh, how are things going and stuff, and they see how you respond, they might be more likely to open up. Or maybe if you even shared a story about, oh, this just happened to so and so, but don't make it sound like you're saying that happened to them, but just that you're sharing it, they might like start to relate to it.
And you said, when we were talking earlier, you said it doesn't just affect the family, it affects the community. Mm-hmm. In what ways?
Well, it affects the community in a lot of ways. One of the basics is that a lot of the children that grow up in domestic violence are more likely to either become abusers or become victims themselves. And there's also a statistic that like 85% of prisoners come from family violence. So having it in your community makes you more likely to start things like getting involved in crimes or getting involved in substance abuse or different things for kids that are going to affect the whole community, because then it might make the community in general more violent and more dangerous.
It's definitely a problem, and it plays a role in a lot of our families and the community as well. Thank you so much for coming in. We can't do enough of this kind of awareness, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Just about everyone experiences parenting challenges, and with all the methodologies out there today, creating solutions for handling a child's misbehavior can be a challenge in itself. My next guest is a father of 3 kids who is going to challenge me with some of the top behavior issues that parents deal with today. Stay with us through the break. We'll be right back.
Child maltreatment, which is both abuse and neglect, is often linked with intimate partner violence and encompasses any act or failure to act on the part of the parent or caregiver which results in harm to a child, including serious physical or emotional, sexual exploitation, or death. Over 670,000 children were identified as victims of child abuse and neglect in 2011. Based on the U.S. Department of Health and Senior Services statistics, this does not take into account children who are victimized more than once in the same year. Similar to the risk of intimate partner exposure, the youngest children are the most vulnerable to maltreatment. In 2011, 27.1% of all reported child abuse victims were younger than 3 years old, and 19.6% were in the 3 to 5 year old range. The vast majority, which was 81.2% of all child maltreatment victims, were maltreated by a parent, either acting alone or with someone else. So another way like intimate partner violence can play into child maltreatment is if like your partner or whoever you're with doesn't like your children, so they kind of force you to like step away from that nurturing, caring parental role, and like so maybe kids are locked in their rooms, they can't come out, they only get to come out to go to the bathroom, take a shower, and eat, and go to school, and any other time they're expected to stay in their rooms, or they're locked in their rooms, or that's just one example, but that's another way like intimate partner violence can have an impact on child maltreatment. To Domestic violence and child abuse, the majority of non-fatal intimate partner violence victimizations on women occurs in the home in the United States. Self-reports by mothers who experienced IPV also found that 44% of their children had been exposed to their victimization. Research suggests that an estimated 30 to 60% of all families where domestic violence is identified, some form of co-occurring child maltreatment is also present. 65% of adults that abuse their partner will also physically and or sexually abuse their children or their partner's children. In 2016, an estimated 1,750 children died from abuse and neglect in the United States, with the highest mortality being in infants, which is children less than a year of age. Approximately 80% of children that die from abuse are under the age of 4. In 2014, children younger than 1 year of age had the highest rate of child abuse victimization of a 24.4 per 1,000 children in the national population of the same age. Children exposed to maternal intimate partner violence, so like the mother being abused without experiencing child maltreatment, were 40% more likely to have behavioral problems than children who were not exposed at all to intimate partner violence. And nearly 2/3 of victims of child maltreatment receive some form of welfare services. What are the short-term effects of domestic and or sexual violence? What are the short-term effects of domestic violence or abuse on children? Children in homes where one parent is abused may feel fearful, anxious. They may always be on guard or hypervigilant, wondering when the next violent event will happen. This can cause a child to react in different ways depending on their age. Children in preschool who witness intimate partner violence may start doing things they used to do when they were younger, such as bedwetting, thumb-sucking, increased crying, whining. They also may develop a difficulty for falling or staying asleep, show signs of terror, such as stuttering or hiding, or show signs of severe separation disorders or anxiety. School-age children may feel guilty about the abuse and blame themselves for it. They also, domestic violence and abuse hurts children's self-esteem. They may not participate in school activities or get good grades. They may have fewer friends than others and get into trouble more often. They also may have a lot of headaches and stomach aches. So some of that, what we talked about earlier, how intimate partner violence and domestic violence can have an effect on your physical health, this is coming through even with children who are in this situation. Teens who witness abuse may act out in negative ways, such as fighting with family members, skipping school, engage in risky behaviors such as unprotected sex, the use of drugs or alcohol. They may have low self-esteem and have trouble making or keeping friends. They may start fights or bully others and are more likely to get in trouble with the law. This type of behavior is more common in teen boys who are abused in childhood than teen girls. Girls are more likely than boys, though, to be more withdrawn and to experience depression. What are the long-term effects of domestic violence or abuse on children? More than 15 million children in the United States live in homes which domestic violence has happened at least once. These children are at greater risk for repeating cycles as adults by entering into abusive relationships or becoming abusers themselves. For example, a boy who sees his mother being abused is 10 times more likely to abuse his female partner than an adult. A girl who grows up in a home where her father abuses her mother is 6 times more likely to be sexually abused as a girl who grows up in a non-abusive home. Children who witness or are victims of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse are at higher risk for health problems as adults. These include mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety, but also physical health conditions like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, some more mental health conditions such as poor self-esteem, and then other problems.
Because of the way the brain works, you will always remember your very first roller coaster ride. Storing these new experiences is one of the brain's main jobs. In fact, your brain creates a mental blueprint of every new experience you have. A blueprint for any new touch is stored in one part of the brain. A blueprint for any new sound in a different part. And a blueprint for any new sight is still another part. But as powerful as that first roller coaster ride was, it can't compete with the lingering effects of your brain's earliest experiences. Although you have no conscious memory of this part of your childhood, it is these very first experiences that literally become the building blocks for your whole life.
Unlike other organs, the brain is undeveloped at birth, and it is waiting for experiences to shape how it will develop. The amazing thing about the human brain is that the younger you are, the more sponge-like your brain is, which is the reason that children in 3 years can learn language, can learn to walk, can do all kinds of incredible things. But the very same biological sponginess that allows us to rapidly acquire language is also the same sponginess that makes young children more vulnerable to trauma than older children.
We have the opportunity to do police ride-alongs to a domestic violence situation, and so this was actually the first call I ever rode along. It was dinner time, and they were having spaghetti for dinner. It was dripping down the walls, the kitchen table was overturned, and we had 3 children in the household. Looking at this whole situation at the time, we said, no evidence of physical harm, the kids are fine. We learned differently, of course. The boy in the corner was classic behavior that we see with kids who have had chronic exposure to violence. He would just completely zone out, numb out as things started to get scary. The 6-year-old little girl on the chair blames herself for what's going on, but actually it was 4 years later that we really appreciated who had some of the most profound or severe harm coming out of this situation, and that was the 6-month-old baby who was now 4.5 and had seriously injured another child in preschool.
It's everyone that is wearing pajamas, please come downstairs for a photo.
Think about this. Most people think young children, they don't really understand what's going on and they're resilient, but the fact is, if anybody's impacted more severely, it's the younger child.
The brain is put together like building blocks in a sense. Those first blocks that go together are the more primitive area of the survival brain.
The brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, so that the normal development of the top part of the brain depends upon healthy development of lower parts of the brain. The top part of the brain, where you do all of your thinking, is the part of the brain that is most changeable, easiest to modify. But unfortunately, if a child has developmental experiences of threat and exposure to domestic violence, the lower parts of the brain will be impacted and are harder to change as they get older.
He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. There was lots and lots of screaming in front of the kids, berating, putting me down, and they pretty much heard it all.
Children exposed to domestic violence, children who witness their parents fighting, literally are experiencing a state of fear. And when this happens, the systems in your brain that are involved in thinking at the top part of your brain are literally shut down. It changes the brains of these children.
My son has seen and heard a lot of the violent outbursts. He was experiencing night terrors, and that was probably his way of dealing with it, because in his waking state, he didn't know how to articulate at 2.5 years old. So it was coming through, when he was asleep.
When kids are chronically stressed, one of the problems that we see is difficulty in attachment and bonding. Because they're so focused on survival, it's hard for them to reach out and connect with others.
My oldest boy went through a stage where he would bully his younger brother and seemingly laugh in glee. He was not remorseful or had no empathy that he could actually make someone cry. Many phone calls of him being disruptive in the classroom. He was a very bright kid, but that's when I knew that he was heading toward trouble.
A lot of these kids get labeled as being, bad, difficult, defiant. This is a very natural response to their circumstance. What the child is doing is a survival strategy for them, but it creates behaviors that are very difficult in the classroom. When they're in a crisis mode, they can't learn.
The tragic reality of children growing up in domestic violence is that they end up with mental health problems at a rate higher than children who are actually the direct victims of physical abuse.
My mother was a victim of domestic violence. My father was an alcoholic, a drug user, and it's just a cocktail for a bad living environment for our children. My brother, he looked like he was crying on his way home. Me not knowing, I was just a careless little 6-year-old, seeing him climb up to my mom's medicine cabinet. I asked him what he was doing, and he boldly said, I'm killing myself. 8-year-old something like that. First person I got to call was my best friend's mom. By the time she came down to our apartment, he had a butcher knife in his hand. He's just cutting himself all over his body, and I was just bawling, just crying. There was nothing I could do to help. My brother was crying. He didn't want to be there. He was trying to run out. But I had already known that my home, wasn't my home. It wasn't a place where I felt safe.
Childhood exposure to violence is about living in a threatening, scary environment that may escalate to physical violence, but it often doesn't have to. It's the chaos, the uncertainty, the fear of being in a home where things aren't okay. Very interesting talking about the roller coaster, because that's what we hear from adult survivors who are in violent households and also the children. The hard part for them, I think, is thinking about what is normal instead of this up and down life of being in a violent, threatening relationship.
Growing up in my home, there were 6 children. My mother and father, unfortunately, fought like cats and dogs. As a result of that, 2 of my brothers ended up being batterers. I have 2 sisters, and even today, they date men that batter them.
Exposure to violence is a lifetime legacy. We see that adults who have had negative childhood experiences often have coping behaviors that can be unhealthy. That certainly has huge effects on how one is going to parent.
It's really important for parents to understand that their internal state, whether it's calm, or whether it's alert engagement, or whether it's frustration and anger, whether it's sadness, depression, the baby absorbs these internal states.
I have been in the moment with that sense of helplessness and hopelessness and stress and anxiety and rage. It really damages the brains of small children to be under a constant level of stress and anxiety. Every day I hope that I haven't damaged my children in that way.
They need to see from you as a parent how to deal with stressful situations in an appropriate manner. Being rational, not resorting to violence to deal with situations. Your children are going to learn how to deal with stress from you.
Luckily, my older son is verbal enough and is old enough now that we have conversations about how did it make you feel when that was going on? Was that scary for you? Yeah, and validating that.
The biggest thing that helps children exposed to violence is to be able to talk about their feelings. Get those critical messages. It's not your fault.
Any conflict, I'm able now to stop before I add to it. I'm able to step away rather than trying to solve it at that moment in a state of heightened anger.
Just try not to go through it alone. If you have a strong support system, and know what avenues you have available to you, in case you do need to get out.
I was glad that we got help when we did.
One of the great things about brain science that we've learned is till the day you die, you have the ability to add new neurons in your brain, that the brain is more like skin in the sense that it can rewire and heal itself in the most important area, the cortex. We have the capacity to heal and do better. The biggest thing we can do for kids exposed to violence is how many healthy adults can they connect to.
I did a lot of my childhood in other people's homes, so I saw what positive relationships were about. I saw my friends were normal. They didn't have the rage I had. Seeing parents that were together, that they showed affection. Home dinners where everybody sat together. Those are the things that I realized were important. And instead of being envious, I incorporated it into my life. I wanted to be a part of that.
I know school is what made a difference for me. The teachers, the attention I got, letting me know that I could be somebody and I could do something.
In fact, my oldest son, his teachers, all 6 of them were very instrumental in coming forward and providing him support when he needed. They allowed him to be homeschooled to give him time to heal.
The hardest part about being a parent now is trying to be different than how my parents raised me. Am I being a good father? What do I need to do to help you feel safe in your home?
That's the part, the brain development part, that I think we want him to know what normal is for us. And normal is having people who support you and who love you and who want to take care of you. And that we want that to be his normal life.
It's one of those pay me now or pay me later. And the truth is, children who are good at self-regulation, good at self-soothing, don't cry very much, and end up being, if you will, successful, are children who have had incredibly attentive early caregiving, which some people, unfortunately, think of as spoiling. It's exactly the opposite. Rather than spoiling the newborn, what you're doing is you are building in healthy self-regulation.
So those are the things that I want to create an environment for my baby where he gets the benefit of what I've learned from all these experts and also other parents. And believe me, they're experts too.
The most important thing that parents need to understand is that the brain of their child will become exactly what the child was exposed to. If you want your child to be kind, then you have to be kind to your child. If you want your child to be good at self-regulation and not lose their temper, you have to not lose your temper. And that's the beauty of the human brain. It is a mirror to the child's developmental experience.
Can children recover from witnessing or experiencing domestic violence or abuse? Each child responds differently to abuse and trauma. Some children are more resilient, while others are more sensitive. How successful a child is at recovering from abuse or trauma depends on several things, including having a good support system, or good relationships with trusted adults, high self-esteem, healthy friendships, and although children will never probably forget what they saw or experienced during the abuse, they can find and learn healthy ways to deal with their emotions and memories as they mature. The sooner a child gets help, the better his or her chances are for becoming a healthy mentally and physically healthy adult. How can I help my children recover after witnessing or experiencing domestic violence? You can help your child by helping them feel safe, talking to them about their fears, talking to them about healthy relationships, talking about boundaries and setting them and keeping them, helping them find a reliable support system, getting them professional help. Your doctor can recommend a mental health professional who works specifically with children who have been exposed to violence or abuse. Many shelters, such as CASA, and other domestic violence organizations have support groups for kids. So like our support groups for kids happen simultaneously with our adult survivors groups. These groups can help children by letting them know that they are not alone and helping them process their experiences in a non-judgmental place. Is it better to stay in an abusive relationship rather than raise children as a single parent? Children do best in safe, stable, loving environments. Whether it's with one parent or two, you may think that your kids won't be negatively affected by the abuse if they never see it happen, but children also hear abuse, such as screaming, the sounds of hitting, breaking glass. They can also see and feel tension and fear. If your kids don't see you being abused, they can still be negatively affected by the violence because they know it's happening. If you decide to leave an abusive relationship, You may be helping your children feel safer by making them less likely to tolerate abuse as they get older. If you decide not to leave, you can still take steps to protect your child. For time's sake, this video here is about 18 minutes long, and it's about why I stayed and why I left. It's a TED Talk. It is in the classroom under, if you look in the link to the videos, it's in there. It should be the maybe like the 11th video down. But for now I'm going to skip this, and if you want to watch it, you can go back and do so. How can I make myself and my children safe right now if I'm not ready to leave an abuser? Your safety and the safety of your children are the biggest priorities. If you are not yet ready or willing to leave an abusive relationship, you can take steps to help yourself and your children now, including making a safety plan for you and your child, listening to your child and letting them know that abuse is not okay and it is not their fault, reaching out to a domestic violence support person or an advocate who can help you learn your options. If you are thinking about leaving an abusive relationship, you might want to keep quiet about it in front of your children. Children have big mouths and they would likely spoil it for you. Young children may not be able to keep a secret from the other adult in their life, whether that's on purpose or accidental. Children may say something about your plan to leave without even realizing it. If it would be unsafe for an abuser or partner to know, it would be unsafe for a partner or an abuser to know ahead of time that you're planning to leave. Talk only to trusted adults about your plan. It's better for you and your children to be physically safe than for your children to know ahead of time that you will be leaving. Some statistics. Studies show that 3 to 4 million children between the ages of 3 and 17 are at risk for exposure to domestic violence each year. 5 million children witness domestic violence each year. And 40 million adult Americans grew up living in domestic violence. Children's feelings affected by domestic violence. So children often feel fearful, anxious, worried, rage, depression, embarrassment, humiliation, isolation, vulnerability, shame, and sadness, and that's just a few. Children's behaviors as affected by domestic violence, they often display behaviors such as sleep disturbances, headaches, stomach aches, bedwetting, inability to focus, acting out, anxiousness to please, poor school performance, poor attendance, developmental delays, aggression, and being withdrawn. Some long-term effects of children who are raised in homes with domestic violence are denied the kind of home life that fosters healthy development. Children learn aggression and violence is an effective way to resolve conflicts or their problems. And they also have a higher risk of substance use, post-traumatic stress disorder, juvenile delinquency, and adult criminality. Their effects on school is that it's been linked to poor school performance. They grow up, when they grow up in domestic violence, they have an impaired ability to concentrate, which can obviously affect their school performance and their difficulty in completing their schoolwork, lower scores on measures of verbal, motor, or social skills. This is another video on the effects of domestic violence. This one's really long. And I'm definitely not going to be able to play it for you guys, so if you're willing to watch it, it is about an hour and 20 minutes long, and it is also in the video playlist that's in the classroom. And it's about the effects of domestic violence on children. Many studies have found an association between intimate partner violence against women and negative social and health consequences for children, including anxiety, depression, poor school performance, and negative health outcomes that we talked about earlier, like diabetes and hypertension. A large body of evidence indicates that exposure to intimate partner violence against the mother is one of the most common factors associated with male perpetration and female experiencing of intimate partner violence later in life. A number of studies have found an association between intimate partner violence and child abuse within the same household. In addition, studies from some low-income countries, including Nicaragua, there we go, and Bangladesh, have found that children whose mothers were abused are less likely to be immunized, have higher rates of diarrheal disease, and or are at greater risk of dying before the age of 5. Violence during pregnancy. Studies have found that substantial levels of physical, intimate partner violence during pregnancy in settings around the world. The WHO multicultural study found prevalences of physical, intimate partner violence in pregnancy ranging anywhere from 1% in urban Japan to 28% in provincial Peru. In prevalences in most sites with a range between 4 to 12%. Similarly, a review of studies from 19 countries found prevalences ranging from 2% in settings such as Australia, Denmark, and Cambodia to 13.5% in Uganda, with the majority ranging between 4 and 9%. A few facility-based studies in some settings have found even higher prevalences, including one from Egypt with an estimated prevalence of pregnancy violence at 32%. And a review of studies from Africa found a prevalence as high as 40% in some settings. Violence during pregnancy is associated with miscarriage, late entry into prenatal care, so seeing doctors and seeking care for yourself and the fetus, stillbirth, premature labor and birth, fetal injury, low birth weight, or small for gestational age weight for infants. IPV may also account for a proportion of maternal mortality, although this association is often unrecognized by policymakers. It also impacts sexual and reproductive health. Intimate partner violence may lead to a host of negative sexual and reproductive health consequences for women, including unattended and unwanted pregnancies, abortion and unsafe abortions, sexually transmitted diseases and infections, including HIV, pregnancy complications, pelvic inflammatory disease, urinary tract infections, and sexual dysfunction. IPV can have a direct effect on women's sexual and reproductive health, such as sexually transmitted infections through forced sexual intercourse within marriage or within a relationship, or through indirect pathways, for example, making it difficult for women to negotiate the use of contraception with their partner. This can also be true for males who are abused, like if a woman refuses to use birth control but doesn't want them to use a condom or any form of barrier protection. And some negative sexual side effects for men who are being abused could also be the unsafe, unprotected sex and the transmission of sexual diseases, sexual dysfunction, but also there could be maybe some issues with reproductive health if the genitals especially have become someplace where women, okay, let's just face it, women know that male genitals are highly sensitive, and so if we're gonna hurt, if a woman were to hurt them, that's probably the best place if it gets physical. So not the, I don't want to say best place, but like, you know what I mean, just like racking them in their junk could cause issues with reproductive health.
Also, with men, it's common for basically they're forced to have children because their partners either tell them they're on birth control or they sabotage the form of contraceptive that they are using in order to cause pregnancy. So
It's trapping him.
One in, I think it was, the statistic that I have, I think it was 1 in 13 men reported that being a thing that has happened to them.
A tactic used?
Yeah.
So the domestic violence cycle is a repetitive cycle of abuse of excuses, honeymoons, routine, tension, trigger, abuse, and so on. So here's just a little example of it. So start at 1. They'll explain the problem away. Then you go back to a honeymoon phase where everything seems great. You return to your routine. Tension starts building again. There's a triggering event which sets off the abuse. Over here in the other one, this is the power and control wheel, also with the cycle. With the tension building phase being the longest phase, and then it kind of explains what an abuser would say in a honeymoon phase. I'm so sorry, gives you gifts, tries to romance you, kind of make you forget that it happened. Things are going to be so great, it'll never happen again. Here's a diamond.
That escalated quickly.
This is a video to kind of explain the power and control wheel. I will play this one because it's only 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And it's good information to understand when you're talking about the power and control wheel. So the power and control wheel is the Duluth model of tactics used by abusers to maintain power and control over their victim. And all of those tactics are surrounded by the presence or threat of physical or sexual violence.
What is domestic violence? This lesson will answer the questions, what is domestic violence? And what is the role of technology in abuse? Let's start with a definition of domestic violence. Domestic violence is purposeful and deliberate behavior aimed at gaining power and control over another person. Domestic violence involves a pattern of coercive behaviors that may include physical, sexual, psychological, or economic abuse. One way to visualize the dynamics of domestic violence is with a power and control wheel. Power and control are in the center of the wheel. The spokes of the wheel are tactics an abuser systematically uses to instill fear in a partner. Physical and sexual violence often occur less frequently, but hold it all together. This violence is the rim of the wheel. Examples of tactics include intimidation, such as destroying property, abusing pets, or displaying guns. Emotionally abusing a partner by making them feel like they are crazy or humiliating them. Isolating their partner, controlling where the victim goes and who they see. Denying the abuse happened, or blaming the victim for the abuse. Threatening to take children away. Exerting privilege. Using economic abuse by preventing the victim from working or controlling all spending. And using coercion and threats, such as threatening suicide or threatening to hurt their partner. While technology can help victims access services and information, it can also be used by abusers to further exert power and control. Perpetrators might use technology to send threats or disturbing information via email, or to post fake or hurtful information on blogs. To monitor or stalk the victim, an abuser might install devices on the victim's car or install spyware on the victim's phone to stalk and track them. Lastly, an abuser may impersonate the victim by sending email from the victim's account or pose as someone else when sending email or text to the victim. Now, test your knowledge. Take the quiz below.
Boom, we're skipping that. There's no quiz. So the death toll, homicide, and other mortality studies range of different countries have found that between 40 and 70% of female murder victims were killed by their husband, boyfriend, or partner, often in the context of an abusive relationship. So domestic violence can have a lethal effect. In addition, evidence shows that intimate partner violence increases the risk of a woman committing suicide. I would say the same thing for men. I don't know how prevalent or how reported that is. And it may also increase the risk of contracting HIV, thus having a AIDS-related death. Mental health and suicide. Evidence suggests that women who are abused by their partners suffer at higher levels of depression, anxiety, phobias than non-abused women. The same goes for men. Like I said before, and Leslie has said too, those things just aren't often reported or studied. In a WHO multi-country study, reports of emotional distress, thoughts of suicide, attempted suicide were significantly higher among those who have experienced physical or sexual violence than those who had not. In addition, intimate partner violence has been linked with drug and alcohol abuse, eating and sleep disorders, physical inactivity, poor self-esteem, post-traumatic stress disorder, smoking, self-harm, and unsafe sexual behavior. PTSD in brief by the Mayo Clinic. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event, either experiencing it or witnessing it. Symptoms may include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, as well as uncomfortable thoughts about the event. Most people who go through traumatic events may experience temporary difficulty adjusting and coping, but with time and good self-care, they usually get better. If symptoms get worse and last for months or even years and interfere with your day-to-day functioning, you may have PTSD. Getting effective treatment after PTSD symptoms develop can be critical to reducing symptoms and improve functioning. Triggers are reminders of the event that transports an individual emotionally to re-experience the trauma of what has occurred. Teen dating violence, which is the dating violence, is the same as domestic violence, except the couples are teenagers and do not typically live together. Often includes technology as a form of control. I know if you're curious about teen dating violence, I believe our children's program has some PowerPoints and educational materials on those things if you would like to reach out to gain access to those. A guide to helping domestic violence survivors. If you know someone who is in a situation, remain calm. Let the survivor decide their own pace for change. Explain all kinds of information thoroughly. Do not impose your values, morals, or beliefs. Encourage each survivor to accept responsibility for their future. Don't convey disappointment if they return to an abusive relationship. The average times that a woman or man leaves and stays gone is 7, which is just an average, because you know that there's people who do it more and there's people who do it less. Be able to tolerate your own anger and the woman's anger or the man's anger, whoever the victim may be in the situation, and then minimize educational, social, economic differences as much as possible. Safety planning is a tool we use to anticipate the dangers and maximize survivor safety. Whether it's like you're staying or you're wanting to leave, having a safety plan in place is going to help plan for anything that could maybe become a risk to your safety.
On loveisrespect.org, they have a actual safety planning worksheet, so that if you or someone that you are close to is trying to leave a relationship, you can go through and answer those questions and have a plan thought out. Obviously don't leave it laying around though, make sure it's somewhere safe.
So a safety plan is actually a unique and consists of concepts such as what do you do, or what do you already know about keeping yourself safe? Separation safety. So if you're leaving, what things do you need to bring with you? What things need to stay? What is helpful to consider to keep you safe? What do we need to put in place to keep you safe? Evaluating your options, planning ahead, reducing risk. There are several things. One of us here at CASA can either help you create a safety plan. You can do it online. There are several places online where you can create one. Like she said, loveisrespect.org. But then there's also, I know there is also some interactive ones that take you question by question and then it develops one. I don't know if that's the love.org one or not. Loveisrespect.org one.
It's an actual just worksheet.
Okay. So just if you need help, we're here to help, and the internet is too. Resources for families affected by domestic violence. A wide range of services is available for those who have experienced violence in their homes or in dating relationships. These include individual counseling sessions for survivors of abuse, whether it's primary or secondary, children, teens as well, who have witnessed it. Family counseling for children and their non-abusive parents group counseling for women, children, and teens, men's groups who have experienced abusive behavior in intimate relationships, case management and advocacy services, including help acquiring public assistance, orders of protection, housing and shelter, as well as referrals to other services when necessary. All of these services listed above are also things that can be provided by CASA, either through the clinical counseling program or through any of our other outreach services, such as court advocacy. We have a housing coordinator, stuff like that. So if you have any questions, you can call us, and if we can't help you, we can refer you to someone who can. So how to help your family? Find outside support. Children who have been exposed to or have witnessed a violent occurrence will need a great deal of support, and often will need counseling in order to handle their feelings. Your pediatrician can help you and your family find an experienced mental health professional to help you and your family in the aftermath of violent experiences. And you'll want to also restore some normalcy. In the weeks and months after a violent or traumatic event, do everything you can to make sure your child feels secure and have a sense of normality that returns to their life. Be very available if needed, and ensure that they are adequately supervised and protected throughout the day and night. Discuss any potential dangerous situations that might exist and how to avoid them in the future. Encourage them to express their fears. Reassure them that they are safe by letting them know the steps that you have taken to ensure their safety and protection. And that's the end. Please take the survey. I'm not entirely sure if we're going to have a quiz on this one, since it's not we're not. This is an optional week, so quizzes and assignments are not something that are going to be tracked. However, you still can get a certificate for participation if you let me know that you've watched it and the date that you have watched it. And if you have any questions, please ask. For any help with resources, also please let me know if you need any help with anything, and I will see you hopefully next time for the final week, which is the optional week on sexual violence.